a midnight nod, and the entire economy shook. On June 4, 2025, at 12:01 a.m., President Trump doubled import tariffs on steel and aluminum to 50%, the highest level since World War II. But instead of targeting China or Russia, the blow landed on Canada, the close neighbor and also the largest metal supplier to the U.S. Inflation surged, and prices of cars, soup cans, beer, and housing skyrocketed. Canada hit back, Mexico waited for its moment, and the EU prepared its move. From metal smelters to supermarket aisles, from car factories to unfinished rooftops, this steel and aluminum war is not just about trade, but a test of trust among allies. So, who is America first really protecting? And who is it hurting? Let's start from that midnight shock, the late-night strike. No warning sirens, no congressional debates, no leaked headlines before the announcement. Just a silent moment in the summer night of Pennsylvania. 12:01 a.m. on June 4, 2025. When America officially activated a decision that would shake every kitchen, every construction site, and every cross-border trade corridor. Import tariffs on steel and aluminum raised to 50%. With a stroke of the pen under the conservative glow of America First, President Donald Trump wasn't just aiming to protect the domestic metal industry, he was aiming for a legacy, a symbol of American industrial might that once made the world stand in awe in the post-Wabiuanfas decades. But this time, that symbol isn't a dream reborn. It's a sharp blow to the very links the U.S. economy now depends on more than ever. If in 2018, when Trump first imposed a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum, the world saw it as a bargaining chip in a geopolitical game, then 2025 is no longer a chess match. It's a deep cut. Because no one expected that cut to fall on Canada, a close trade partner that once supplied over 60% of aluminum and 25% of steel to the U.S. And when those numbers hit the new tariff wall, every production line from Ottawa to Ohio instantly turned into a minefield. The issue isn't that Canada was punished, but that the American industry isn't ready to replace what it just sanctioned. New electric furnaces haven't been built, domestic supply isn't strong enough, and energy remains a high-cost puzzle. That's why, when Washington hit the 50% tariff button, what spiked wasn't just metal prices, it was a chain reaction beyond control. The market reacted in a flash. U.S. aluminum prices jumped to over 60 cents per pound, up 190% since Trump's return to the White House. Domestic steelmakers like Nucor and Century Aluminum celebrated. But on the other side of the board, Ford and GM saw their stocks tumble 3 to 4% within 48 hours. It was a signal that the players understood well. Winning in one industry can mean losing in 5 others. But the most worrying thing isn't in the red charts. It's in the silence of those most deeply affected. American consumers. People without stocks, without federal contracts, without a voice in trade negotiations. They only have the bill, a can of beans, a case of beer, a pickup truck. Things that once represented the American dream now bear an added cost from this metal game. And when asked why, the only answer is national security. But security isn't a slogan that can cover the fact that more than half of America's aluminum over the past 2 years came from Canada, a country that poses no threat, doesn't manipulate prices, and doesn't dump cheap steel by undercutting labor. So, who is this punishment really protecting, and who is it punishing? Perhaps that's the question small factories in Indiana are asking as they receive new price quotes for thick steel coils. Or the construction workers in Texas, re-evaluating project estimates upon learning that building material costs per home may rise by nearly $11,000. And it's certainly something that 1.5 million Americans, in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota should care about, since power from Ontario might be Canada's next retaliation card. In that moment, we suddenly realize America First isn't just a policy. It's a gamble. And the one placing the bet isn't just Washington. It's every American holding a receipt, wondering why today's can of soup costs more than yesterday's. Canada is silent no more. They used to be the most trusted friend, the right hand in every agreement, the place America relied on to stabilize prices of aluminum, steel, and cross-border energy. But on the morning of June 4, 2025, when the news of the 50% import tariff swept across financial broadcasts in Ottawa, Canada was silent no more. The shock didn't come from the number. 50% is high, but not unprecedented. What made Canadians feel betrayed was that they weren't on America's list of trade enemies. They didn't manipulate the market, didn't undercut prices, didn't force workers to accept dirt-cheap wages. They simply supplied metal by the rules, at fair prices, under agreed terms. Yet they were punished like those who do manipulate. In Toronto, the mood wasn't anger, it was cold calculation. On the very day the tariffs were announced, Ontario Premier Doug Ford didn't hold back diplomatic language. He declared that if Washington continued to disregard bilateral relations, Canada would strike back with the very thing the U.S. is short on: electricity. Not as a threat, but as a fact. 1.5 million Americans in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota would have to ask themselves one question: who holds the switch? But Canada's counterattack wasn't just about energy. Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly, who had led electric power and trade negotiations throughout 2024, no longer played the role of soft diplomacy. On June 6, 2025, standing at a metal factory in Hamilton, she announced that the Made in Canada strategy would be strictly applied to all federal contracts, from defense infrastructure to roads, hospitals, and ports. Meaning, American steel and aluminum were officially shut out of Canada's public sector. It was no longer a speech, it was a signal. Ottawa had chosen confrontation. And they weren't alone. Unions like Unifor and United Steelworkers, which represent the majority of the workforce in Canada's auto and metal sectors, released a joint statement demanding the government immediately increase retaliatory tariffs on American goods worth nearly 29.8 billion Canadian dollars, a package quietly prepared since early this year. From factories in Sudbury to the port of Halifax, the attitude now wasn't wait for America to back down, but let them feel the consequences. That atmosphere, if described accurately, was the feeling of a nation long used to being a supporting role, and now deciding to step onto center stage. Because Canada, though smaller than the U.S. in population and GDP, is not small on the global metal board. In 2024, it supplied over 60% of the aluminum imported into the U.S., and over one-third of the steel used in car production in Detroit, Toledo, and Chicago. America cutting that source off suddenly is no different than cutting off oxygen mid-climb. And Ottawa knows exactly where the weak spots are. Proof? Immediately after the Made in Canada announcement, stocks of several U.S. suppliers took a hit. U.S. Steel dropped 6%, Alcoa lost 4.5%, while companies from Australia and Brazil, countries not targeted by Canada's retaliatory tariffs, rose 2 to 3% in 48 hours. The market didn't wait for political statements. The market understood. This retaliation isn't emotional, it's strategically logical. That's precisely why Prime Minister Mark Carney, known for his calm demeanor, personally reached out to the White House. The first exchange revealed no details, but was described as serious, direct, and uncompromising. Canada doesn't want to sever ties, but it will no longer allow itself to be treated as the 51st state, as one U.S. congressman once mockingly said. And that very phrase, "We are not anyone's 51st state," has become the most viral slogan across Canadian social media in June. On Twitter, X, in morning news broadcasts, on factory posters, it appeared as a declaration of identity. Canada is no longer the shadow of U.S. trade policy. So, when the U.S. chose to swing the tariff hammer to reshape the metal industry, it didn't just strike at the flow of metal. It struck at the trade alliance that had long underpinned the North American economy. And this time, Canada isn't the one sitting on the sidelines. They've stood up, and they've brought an entire industry with them. From a can of soup to the American dream? If you want to measure how deeply a policy impacts a country, don't ask the markets. Take a walk through the supermarket. Look at the shelves, where cans of beans, tuna tins, packs of beer, or even the shopping cart itself are beginning to tell a different story. A story of every penny adding up, of layers of cost that American consumers are now shouldering. And it all starts with a decision called the 50% import tariff. In just the first week after President Trump's order took effect, businesses in the food and packaging industries already felt the pressure of metal. According to the Can Manufacturers Institute, CMI, the cost of raw materials for metal packaging rose by an average of 12 to 17% in less than 10 days. Robert Budway, president of CMI, stated plainly, "From tomato growers to packagers to the supermarket shelf, no one can absorb this cost without passing it on to the consumer." It's no coincidence that major packaging corporations like Ball Corp and Crown Holdings had to immediately establish emergency response teams. Not for natural disasters, but to handle an artificial price storm triggered by trade policy. Preliminary estimates show that this rise in input costs alone could raise the price of a basic canned food item by 6 to 11 cents. That may seem minor, but for a household consuming an average of 400 canned goods per year, the total loss will be $24 to $44 per person annually. Not to mention long-term compounded inflation. But food is only the beginning. The biggest blow has fallen on a symbol of modern American culture: craft beer. In Arizona, Massachusetts, and Colorado, states known for their craft beer scenes, hundreds of small producers are struggling with the reality that 76% of their products are packaged in aluminum cans, and each can now cost an additional 2 to 6 cents just for the container. That may seem trivial until you learn that the average profit margin of craft breweries is only 5 to 8%. This means a single can price hike could push them into the red. Brands like Treehouse Brewing and Four Peaks have begun switching to glass bottles, slower, more expensive, and less popular. Some breweries in the Pacific Northwest are even considering halting production of seasonal beer lines to avoid accumulated losses. What was once a source of local pride, tied to festivals, culture, and livelihoods, is now a silent victim of a trade war without bullets. Next comes the auto industry, another cornerstone symbol of America. Just 3 days after the tariff order, shares of Ford and General Motors dropped by 3 to 4%, not due to revenue loss, but from the looming prospect of skyrocketing component costs. Estimates show that 30 to 40% of parts in a modern vehicle use imported steel or aluminum. From chassis to engine casing, from radiators to interior panels. With the new tariffs, input costs per vehicle could increase by $800 to $1,200. And if automakers are forced to pass that cost to buyers, showroom prices would rise by $1,500 to $2,300 depending on the model. Many car loan applicants, especially middle-class families, students, or recent graduates, will no longer qualify for personal vehicle financing. The dream of owning an American car is no longer out of reach, it's out of budget. And don't forget, The price shock doesn't stop at factories and supermarkets. It seeps into every family's budget. When beer prices rise, people buy less. When canned food gets more expensive, people switch to cheaper frozen goods, often with lower nutritional value. When cars become unaffordable, people extend the life of older vehicles, increasing road safety risks. And all of these consequences add up to a troubling reality. Inflation is no longer a macroeconomic concept. It's a daily fear. The irony is, while American consumers struggle to keep up, other nations, once branded trade rivals, are seizing the opportunity to capture new markets. Australia, Brazil, the UAE, and Turkey have begun ramping up production, pushing metal exports to Europe and Asia at competitive rates, while the U.S. reverts to economic isolation. It's a reversal of the entire trade logic of over 40 years of integration. So the next time you pick up a can of soup, a pack of beer, or sign a contract for a new car, ask yourself, are you paying more for production costs or for a slogan? And if the American dream grows more expensive by the day, are we truly buying pride? Or just paying the price of economic loneliness? The shifting line. Something is quietly unfolding in the wake of the 50% steel tariff. American businesses are starting to redraw their maps, no longer within U.S. soil. When the numbers no longer add up, when production costs spiral out of control, and when the market reacts with silent reduction in demand, the most natural thing for a corporation to do is find a way out. And that escape route now no longer lies in Cleveland or Pittsburgh, but in Monterey, Hanoi, or the outskirts of Jakarta. Not long after the tariff policy was enacted, an internal report from the American Automotive Manufacturers Association, AAMA, revealed at least 37% of parts suppliers are planning to shift part of their production overseas within the next 12 to 18 months. The reason isn't just raw material prices. Energy costs in the U.S., particularly in metal processing and fabrication, are now 26 to 31% higher than in Southeast Asian countries. With the new tariffs, that gap becomes a chasm. In Mexico, the Nuevo León industrial zone, once a supply satellite for GM and Tesla factories in Texas, is accelerating its steel stamping lines. Canadian investors have even injected capital into the region, hoping to replace supply disruptions from the northern border. In a notable development, major corporations like Magna International and Flex Engate have begun recruiting engineers from Michigan to train Mexican teams, transferring technology right into the heart of a competing partner. In Vietnam, 2 aluminum shell manufacturers for U.S. electric vehicle batteries have just signed new land lease agreements in Bac Ninh and Binh Duong. One of them is a direct supplier to Rivian, the fledgling EV company once praised by the White House as a symbol of clean American manufacturing. Now, due to rising aluminum costs, they are reworking their financial strategy without needing America. The question arises, is this a temporary reaction? The answer lies in long-term contracts. In trade, nothing signals strategy more clearly than 5-year, 10-year contracts. And America's rivals are launching a wave of incentive policies to attract the capital flows exiting North America. Brazil's government has pledged to fully refund investment taxes within 18 months for any new steel plant. Turkey offers total import tax exemptions for metallurgical equipment from the EU. Vietnam is slashing corporate income taxes by 50% for sectors interfacing with U.S. industry. A direct reference to the very fields the U.S. just made difficult for itself. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the situation is the complete opposite. According to data from the U.S. Department of Energy, nearly 62% of small and medium-sized metal fabrication plants cannot meet current electricity consumption standards if output increases. This leaves them stuck. Expanding means hitting legal limits. Staying put means operating at a loss. And raising prices drives customers away. A production director in Illinois said bluntly in an anonymous survey, "We're not against protectionist policy, but if I lose customers because I can't compete, then I have no business left to protect." Among experts, this is called the boomerang effect of policy, when the goal of protecting one industry ends up putting supporting sectors into a survival crisis. Because in a linked economy like America's, metallurgy doesn't stand alone. It is input material for more than 11,000 dependent industries, from aerospace, medical devices, clean energy to hospital bed frames. And when those industries are forced to seek materials elsewhere, they will soon find labor, infrastructure, and markets elsewhere too. Meaning, the American value chain isn't just importing inputs anymore, it's beginning to export itself. Ironically, the slogan "Bring Jobs Back" once gave people hope that factories would light up the Rust Belt again. But now, as financial giants quietly sign land lease agreements in Puebla, Bakjiang, and Izmir, the question is no longer should we return to America, but how much longer should we stay? The 50% tariff policy, on paper, may appear to be a defensive weapon, but in reality, that weapon is pushing manufacturers out of the very trenches the government wants them to hold. And in this globalization war, the one who retreats first may be the one who loses the most. Counterattack from 3 fronts. If America thinks it is striking steel and aluminum, the rest of the world understands clearly. This is a declaration of war. And when a superpower unilaterally swings the tariff sword, those who were once allies, from Canada to Mexico and the European Union, do not stand still. They don't talk much. They act. Canada, the first and clearest response. Just 72 hours after the 50% tariff took effect, Ottawa announced a retaliation package worth $29.8 billion Canadian dollars on a range of U.S. goods, from steel, aluminum to packaged foods, industrial machinery, and consumer products. But what matters isn't just the number. It's the way Canada retaliated that made Washington take a hard look. Instead of targeting non-essential imports, Canada aimed directly at strategic goods from swing states, like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These are regions with many middle-class voters, strong manufacturing and agricultural sectors, and they directly influence the upcoming presidential election. For example, Wisconsin's dairy industry, which exports millions of liters annually to Canada, suddenly faced a 25% tariff. Ohio's canned meat processing industry, which uses aluminum for packaging, was hit with an additional 18%, while simultaneously being blocked from accessing Canadian government procurement contracts. Ottawa didn't strike emotionally. They struck with data. And every one of those numbers sends a cold message. We know exactly where to touch to make Washington listen. Mexico. Slow but dangerous. Unlike Canada, Mexico didn't react loudly, but don't mistake that for softness. When asked about America's 50% tariff policy, President Claudia Sheinbaum said just one sentence: "We will respond proportionally. No more, no less." And that response began at the Laredo border crossing, which handles nearly $250 billion in goods annually between the two countries. Within 2 weeks of the tariff order, customs clearance time at Mexico's northern border doubled, and dozens of containers carrying auto parts, industrial aluminum, and processed food were stuck waiting. Due to technical reasons. No need for a trade war declaration. Just by slowing the flow of trade, Mexico has sent a clear signal. We control the software of the American supply chain. It didn't stop there. Mexico's tax authorities began investigating 7 U.S. companies for import tax evasion, including 2 tech firms and a major agricultural corporation based in Iowa. And this is only the beginning. Mexico's Ministry of Economy is considering tariffs on corn and soybeans imported from the U.S., the very crops millions of farmers in Nebraska and Kansas rely on. They didn't fire a cannon, they're tightening the ropes. The European Union, silent but not passive. Brussels hasn't issued any particularly strong official statement since the U.S. 50% tariff took effect. But that doesn't mean they aren't preparing. In fact, the European Commission has held 3 emergency internal meetings in June, focused on the risk of scrap aluminum and strategic EU supplies leaking to the U.S. Why? As aluminum prices in the U.S. soared, many EU recyclers began selling scrap to the American market, where prices were double. This caused a shortage of recycled inputs for domestic plants, pushing raw aluminum prices in Europe up 11% in just 3 weeks. To respond, the EU is considering an emergency export restriction mechanism, a temporary 6-month ban on exporting scrap aluminum and recycled steel to the U.S. If this measure is triggered, the U.S. will lose access to cheap supplies previously used to lower production costs, which will further inflate domestic inflation. Simultaneously, France and Germany are pushing a recycled metal alliance with Gulf countries, especially the UAE and Bahrain, which are emerging as safe alternative suppliers for European and Asian supply chains. Every new contract signed in Abu Dhabi is a strategic step back for the U.S. in the global supply chain war. So when the U.S. imposes tariffs to protect manufacturing identity, the rest of the world has begun rebuilding a trade system that doesn't need America. No withdrawal declarations, no demands for negotiation. They are shifting axes and leaving America standing alone. The world doesn't retaliate with rage. They counter with strategy. And that is what Washington should fear most. When the world turns away from Washington. The world doesn't stand still when America turns its back. While Washington tightens its America First policy, the rest of the planet is quietly, yet decisively, restructuring the entire global supply chain. And this time, there's no place for the U.S. at the center. The metal migration has begun, without noise, without slogans, but carrying the most sweeping strategic shift since the Cold War. In the Middle East, what went unnoticed in March 2025 suddenly became headline news in June. The UAE and Bahrain, which previously held less than 3% of global aluminum market share, now account for over 8% of aluminum exports to the U.S. In less than a year, aluminum exports from the UAE to the U.S. rose from 16,000 tons to over 68,500 tons, March 2025, an increase of more than 325% in just 12 months. But this influx wasn't something Washington desired. It was the result of U.S. companies scrambling to import goods before the 50% tariff officially took effect. American industrial firms no longer believe Canada or Mexico will remain safe backyard zones, so they are betting on suppliers halfway around the globe. However, the Emirates didn't just stand there waiting for orders. They immediately expanded metallurgical production lines, signed a flurry of bilateral trade agreements with the EU, India, and Indonesia, and committed to stable deliveries for the next 10 years. In other words, by the time the U.S. looked around for reliable supply, the world had already divided the spoils. In South America, Brazil quickly seized the metal storm. In May 2025, the Brazilian government reinstated a 25% tax on 19 categories of imported steel products, not to protect domestic producers, but to stabilize the local market and reserve raw materials for strategic partners in Asia. India and Brazil, two rising economies, struck a cross-block supply agreement worth over $2.3 billion, including extruded aluminum for the construction industry and stainless steel used in aerospace, segments once dominated by the U.S., but now losing end customers due to its own pricing and tax policies. Even Turkey, long just an intermediary producer, has now pivoted exports toward Southeast Asia, signing contracts with Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, countries now absorbing U.S. factory relocations due to lower production costs. Each of those contracts is a brick in the new trade order, one in which the U.S. is no longer the obligatory corridor. In Europe, an irony is unfolding. When European metal recyclers realized their scrap aluminum was being bought by the U.S. at record prices, over 60 cents per pound, or more than $1,300 per ton, they immediately redirected their flow. The result? The European Union is now facing its worst recycled aluminum crisis in 15 years. The European Aluminium Association has warned, without tighter controls, Europe will lose its ability to self-supply key sectors like electric vehicles, green construction, and defense. And in that scenario, the U.S., once a victim of inflation, becomes the cause of a global supply crisis. And while the U.S. tries to revive arc furnace plants and made-in-America smelters, the world is rewriting production logic without America. New investment flows are pouring in. India receives $3.5 billion from a Norwegian investment fund to develop its green metallurgy sector. Malaysia and Indonesia sign a $4.2 billion deal with Germany to jointly mine bauxite and refine clean aluminum. Australia inks an accelerated supply agreement with Japan and South Korea, promising delivery within 6 weeks instead of the previous 3 months. They all share one trait: a world withdrawing from U.S.-centered supply chains. A new order, quieter, less dependent, and also harder to reverse. There's no breakup announcement. No one says, "We don't need America anymore." But as contracts are being signed in Mumbai, Abu Dhabi, São Paulo, and Frankfurt, one thing is clear. The world no longer waits for Washington's green light. Global trade, once revolving around the dollar and the slogan "Made in USA," now revolves around flexibility, cost, and the absence of America. And perhaps that won't change, even if those tariffs are lifted one day. Because once supply chains move away, they rarely come back. America first or America alone. When the slogan "America First" echoed from the steel and wood podium of a factory in Pennsylvania, it wasn't just a campaign message. It was a declaration of economic sovereignty, a signal to the world that the United States was willing to isolate itself if that meant protecting an industry, a block of jobs, or a historical symbol. But what the administration may have miscalculated is this: the world no longer runs on symbols. It runs on data, speed, flexibility, and connectivity. And if America chooses the path of building fences, the rest of the world is moving faster and going around. 6 weeks after the 50% tariff policy was implemented, the ripple effects are reaching the core of the American economy. Hot-rolled steel prices are up 22%. Industrial aluminum is up 19%. The cost of building a new home has increased by an average of $10,900 per unit. Automobile production costs have risen by $1,800 per vehicle. Retail prices of canned goods have risen between 6 to 14%. These numbers aren't on cabinet reports. They're on the weekly bills of middle-class families who are now starting to choose between a new car and college tuition, between roof repairs and a postponed summer vacation, between spending on dinner or paying insurance. Meanwhile, the industries this policy promised to rescue have yet to truly bloom as expected. Although factories like Nucor and Century Aluminum have announced expansion plans worth nearly $1.2 billion, what's notable is this: these projects will take 18 to 36 months to become operational, meaning the benefits are in the future, but the costs are being paid by the people today. Experts from the National Productivity Council warn that unless the U.S. urgently adjusts tariff policies or domestic supply, by the end of 2025, America could lose up to 4% of its downstream manufacturing capacity in sectors like solar energy, medical devices, and commercial aviation. That doesn't just affect GDP, it affects national security, the very thing this policy claims to protect. So, after all, what is America gaining? And what is it losing? Gains include a few jobs that may be retained or revived in metallurgy plants. Gains include a sense of economic sovereignty, like a declaration of independence in a globalized world. Gains include a few made-in-America construction projects that appear more domestic. But the losses? They are many, and often unseen until people begin to live with them. Loss of price stability, when inflation no longer comes from abroad, but from internal policies. Loss of competitiveness, when companies leave the U.S. to protect their profit margins. Loss of seamless supply chains, when partners like Canada, Mexico, and the EU no longer see the U.S. as the default option. And loss of status, not because America has grown weaker, but because other nations have grown stronger without needing America. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney once said something cold yet profound. If they think we'll back down because of tariffs, they don't understand Canada. And if they think the world will line up waiting for America's approval, they don't understand the world. That is no longer a warning, it is a reality forming by the hour. As metal supply chains shift toward Southeast Asia, as Europe begins protecting its recycled aluminum, as Brazil and the UAE sign bilateral pacts that bypass Washington, as American corporations land in Monterey instead of Michigan. America First may have started as a policy, but if not careful, it could end as a farewell. And the question now is no longer, can America still lead? It's this: can America keep walking alone without paying the price of its own dream?